Chapter 28. Once safely inside the cottage, Jan poured herself a glass of water and then set about making something to eat. It was 2 p.m. and she was hungry after all the exercise. Tinder was exhausted. He flopped out on his rug by the hearth and was soon asleep. Jan took the frying pan from its hook, threw in a knob of butter and whisked some eggs for an omelette. As she worked, her thoughts returned to Chris and Anne. He was a strange one for sure. When she'd first met him, he'd seemed so upfront and uncomplicated, a what you saw was what you got type of bloke. Yet clearly there was another side to Chris completely, one she didn't like. Secretive, moody, evasive. Just as well it had ended when it had. Jan added salt and pepper to the frothy egg mixture and tipped it into the hot frying pan. The fat splattered. As the omelette set, she grated cheese for the filling. She was about to chop some tomatoes when the doorbell rang. Tinder woke and looked at her from his rug in the living room. Perhaps it was the postman. He came in his van to the cottage if there was any mail. Sometimes he rang the bell as he pushed the letters through the letterbox to let her know they had arrived. But it was a bit late for him. He usually came in the morning. Jan moved the pan from the heat and went into the hall. There was no mail lying on the mat. She opened the front door. There was no one outside. No car or mail van either. Strange. She looked around. The lane was deserted as far as she could see in both directions. Then she saw it, and her heart missed a beat. Positioned on the doorstep was the ball of twine Tinder had found in the wood and she had thrown towards the back garden. She was sure it was the same one. It looked identical. It hadn't been here when she'd arrived back. She stared at it in disbelief, then looked up and down the lane again. Kicking it off the step, Jan quickly closed the door. How had it got there and why? Had Chris and Anne found it and brought it back? No, that seemed ridiculous. The chance of them finding it in the woods was tiny, and why would they go to all the trouble of returning it, assuming they'd known it had come from Camille's shed? But the alternative, that someone she didn't know had brought it back, was even more worrying. It would mean that they had been watching her in the woods, following her, had seen her pick up the twine, throw it, and knowing it had come from the shed, had brought it back. Was someone watching her and playing games to frighten her? If so, they were succeeding. Calm down, she told herself. Don't do anything rash. Going into the living room, she picked up her phone and texted Chris. Did you leave a ball of twine on the doorstep of the cottage? He'd probably think she was even more neurotic than he already did, but she needed to eliminate him. A minute later came his reply. No, I didn't. Are you okay? I'm fine, she replied testily. But she wasn't. Far from it. Someone was out there, watching her. Perhaps it was time to pack and leave the cottage. She'd have to give Camille notice so she could make alternative arrangements for Tinder. Or should she call DC Matt Davis? But what would she say? That she'd found a ball of twine in the woods that had come from the shed and someone had left it on her doorstep? Surely that would be called wasting police time, and goodness knows what Matt would think of her. What she needed was someone to talk to, Jan thought. Someone who knew her well and could be relied upon to give her an honest opinion and sound advice. Ruby. She'd already offered to stay for Christmas, but Jan couldn't wait that long. Christmas was still weeks away. She needed to speak to her now. A couple of rings and then, Hi, Jan, lovely to hear from you. And you. Can you talk? For a bit. Why, what's the matter? You sound uptight. I am. Jan immediately confessed. "Ruby, there's stuff going on here at the cottage. I don't understand. Weird stuff. I need to tell you about and get your opinion on." "Are you in some kind of danger?" Ruby asked, worried. "I honestly don't know." "That doesn't sound like you, Jan. I've only got a few minutes now. How about I come over and visit you tomorrow? I've already booked a couple of days off work." "Oh, would you? That would be fantastic." "Sure. I'll drive up first thing in the morning and then come back on Saturday." "Lovely. Thank you so much." "You'll be okay till then?" "Yes." "I'll see you around midday tomorrow." "Thank you." As they ended the call, Jan's phone bleeped with a text message. It was from Camille. "Everything okay at the cottage?" Too much of a coincidence, Jan thought. Doubtless Chris had said something to her. "Yes, thanks," she replied. Chapter 29. Despite telling Ruby she'd be okay until the following day, Jan hardly slept a wink that night. Every noise suggested someone was outside trying to break in or were already in the cottage and coming to get her. The wind didn't help. She kept her phone in her hand, ready to call for help if necessary, and left the hall and landing lights on. Eventually, she brought Tinder up to sleep on her bed. Then at 2 a.m., when she was still wide awake, the lights suddenly went out. Panic gripped her until she realized that leaving all the lights on had drained the meter. She didn't dare get out of bed now and go downstairs in the dark to feed the meter. So she pulled the bed covers up over her head and waited for morning. Thank goodness Ruby was coming today, Jan thought as the sky outside finally lightened and she could get up. Ruby would know what to do for the best. She was Jan's oldest and probably closest friend. She knew how to have a laugh, but could also be relied on to be level-headed and objective when necessary. Ruby wasn't someone given to flights of fantasy. But then neither had Jan been, she reminded herself, before coming to live in Ivy Cottage. Throwing on her dressing gown, she went downstairs, fed Tinder, and set the coffee to brew. Tinder ate some of his breakfast and then began pawing at the back door to be let out for his morning run. Jan slid the bolts and turned the key. As she opened the door, she saw it, and her legs went weak. She couldn't believe it. The ball of twine she'd kicked off the front doorstep the afternoon before was now on the patio, directly in front of the back door, positioned so she couldn't miss it. Someone had placed it there on purpose. There was no other explanation. Her legs felt like jelly. So the noises she'd heard in the night hadn't all been her imagination. Her stomach churned. While she'd been in bed, whoever it was had taken the twine from the front garden and brought it round to the back and left it right where she would see it, letting her know they were still out there, watching her. She felt sick with fear. But why were they here? What did they want with her? Keeping one hand on the door ready to close it quickly if necessary, Jan reached out and with trembling fingers was about to pick up the twine. Then she stopped. No, she'd leave it where it was to show Ruby. It would be evidence that what she was saying was true. Tinder, having done his business, returned up the garden, sniffed the twine, and then came in. Jan closed and bolted the back door, her thoughts racing. Was she in danger? Ruby had asked yesterday, and Jan had replied she didn't know. Now she did. Without a doubt, she was being targeted. Should she call the police again? And say what? A ball of twine had found its way from the woods to her front doorstep, and then the patio. It made her sound ridiculous, unbalanced. She'd wait to see what Ruby had to say. In the meantime, She needed to get a grip and think rationally. There were things she had to do. Jan poured a mug of coffee and took it upstairs to drink while she washed and dressed. She needed to buy food for dinner so she could make Ruby something decent to eat. But she certainly wouldn't be walking along Wood Lane to the village store, not with the chance of whoever was out there stalking her. Tinder would have to forego his walk today. She would take her car and drive into Coleshaw. It would do her good to be in a town again with lots of people, and the supermarkets there would have a much better choice than the local store. She should leave as soon as she was ready to make sure she was back in plenty of time for when Ruby arrived. Jan took her empty mug downstairs, shut Tinder in the living room, and collecting her jacket and bag, left the cottage. The air was chilly, and she slipped on her coat as she went to the car. She was about to get in when she noticed muddy streaks over the car roof. As she looked more closely, she could see them on the bonnet too. Most of the leaves had been blown off in the wind last night, revealing these muddy track marks, as if something had been on her car. But the marks were fresh, recent. She looked more closely. They were too large for a cat or fox, and not the right shape. Muddy prints, similar to those she had seen in the gap in the hedge when she had cut the grass. She traced their path. Whatever it was had run over the bonnet and up the windscreen, slipping as it went, then across the roof of the car and slipped down the back. Jan looked around her. There was nothing to be seen. The trees and foliage were still, but she had the feeling she was being watched, just as she had in the garden. She quickly took a photo on her phone of the track marks, more evidence to show Ruby, then got into the car, pressed the central locking system, and began the drive to Coleshaw. Chapter 30. Don't go anywhere near this place. They're in it for their own selfish ends. Miss L's online review of the Moller Clinic had read. Ian had dismissed it when he'd first read it, but now he'd visited the clinic and met the Mollers. He thought there might be something in it, but what? It was Friday morning, and Ian was sitting at his office desk trying to catch up with his work. It was proving very difficult. There was so much going on in his private life, it was virtually impossible to concentrate, but he needed to try. He'd taken a lot of time off since Emma's miscarriage, and while management was still being supportive and sympathetic, he knew it wouldn't last forever. At some point, they would expect him to get over it and stop pulling his weight again. Ian's thoughts drifted to the argument he'd had with Emma that morning. It had started because he'd brought up the matter of the DNA tests again. Then he'd made it worse by saying he thought she should return to work, part-time at least. She was still signed off sick. He thought he'd phrased it well, but she'd burst into tears, accused him of being self-centered and caring more about his bloody research than he did about her. He'd left soon after to come to work and had texted an apology, but she hadn't replied. His thoughts returned to the review. Don't go anywhere near this place. How he would have liked to have spoken to Miss L and asked her exactly what she'd meant. He'd found the review online again, but couldn't see any way of contacting her. Clearly she'd had issues with the clinic, but why? Was it their manner or something else? There are rumours, the lad in the village shop had said, but that could be no more than malicious gossip. Ian fiddled with his pen and stared at the report he was supposed to be writing. The DNA test kits he'd ordered should arrive tomorrow, Saturday. There was no postal service on Sunday, so he'd send them off first thing on Monday. He'd opted for the results to be emailed, which was the fastest method, so hopefully he'd have them early next week. Of course, it could turn out that Caster Moller had been right all along, and he and Emma didn't share the same genes. That's what Emma believed, and that he'd become obsessed, a witch hunt to find someone to blame for them not being able to have a family. Which is more or less what Moller had said. Get on with your life and be grateful you're both healthy, intelligent, and able to do well. If the DNA test showed he and Emma weren't related, then he would accept it and agree to bereavement counselling, as Emma wanted. Don't go anywhere near this place. They're in it for their own selfish ends. But why, Miss L? Why? Chapter 31. Jan paused to read Ruby's text. Should be with you at 12. Great. See you soon, she replied, and then continued up and down the aisles in the supermarket, loading her basket. It was nearly 11 a.m, and only an hour before Ruby arrived. Jan had been longer than she thought. She'd enjoyed the hustle and bustle of the busy supermarket, and had taken her time choosing what to buy. She quickly gathered together the last of the items, then joined the queue at the checkout. It was long. Friday shoppers stocking up for the weekend. It was 11:20 by the time Jan had paid and left the supermarket. As she was crossing the car park, she realised she'd forgotten coffee. Drat. She wasn't going back to stand in that queue again. She'd stop off at Lillian's store in Merryless. She'd also get some more change for the meter while she was there. The roads out of Coleshaw were busy, so it was 11:50 before Jan drew up outside the shop in Merryless. Before getting out, she texted Ruby just in case she got to the cottage before she did. We'll be there shortly. Kiss. She was about to open her car door when she saw Chris go into the shop. Damn and blast. She really didn't want to meet him right now. It would be embarrassing after their disastrous evening, and then bumping into him with Anne yesterday. She had nothing to say to him. She waited in the car for a few moments longer, but he didn't reappear. She couldn't wait indefinitely. He might be in there for some time talking to his sister-in-law. Steeling herself, Jan got out and went into the shop. Chris was at the counter talking to Lillian with his back to her. "Hi, Jan," Lillian called, while Chris didn't even bother to turn, not even a nod of acknowledgement. Well, sod him, Jan thought. Keeping her gaze away from them, Jan went over to the shelves containing the packets of filter coffee and pretended to browse, as Lillian wound up their conversation. "Give my love to Mel and the little ones," she said. Jan had no idea who Mel was. She waited until Chris had left the shop before she took the packet of coffee to the counter. "Can I have some meter money as well, please?" "Sure, love. How are you?" "Fine, thanks." Lillian went into the back office to fetch the coins from the safe. "How did your date go?" she asked, setting the bag of £1 coins on the counter. "With Chris?" Jan asked. Surprised Lillian had mentioned it. Surely Chris would have told her. "Well, yes, unless you've been dating others," Lillian said with a smile. "It wasn't good. I doubt we'll see each other again." "Oh, dear. I'm sorry to hear that." She seemed genuinely concerned. "Didn't Chris mention it to you then?" Jan asked as she paid. "I haven't seen him since Wednesday," Lillian replied. Jan stared at her and thought she must have misheard. "He was in here just now. You were talking to him." "No," Lillian laughed. "That was Robert Jarvis. They look similar from a distance, but Robert is happily married with 3 children. "Oh," Jan felt foolish. "You're not the only one to make that mistake. There's a few round here that look similar. Camille does. Have you met her?" "No. Chris gave me the keys to the cottage." Jan thought back to the photographs of Chris and Camille. and how alike and compatible they'd appeared. "Why did Camille and Chris split?" Jan asked, tucking the meter money and coffee into her bag. "I'm really not sure," Lillian said. "I'm sorry it didn't work out on Wednesday. A nice girl like you. I'll tell Chris off when I see him." Jan smiled. "That's kind, but probably best not to say anything. I think he already has someone else." "Not as far as I know," Lillian said, surprised. "What makes you think that?" I saw him yesterday while I was walking tinder in the woods. He was with someone called Anne." "Anne?" Lillian asked, puzzled. "I've no idea who that could be. The only Anne I know is a local midwife, and she's not Chris's type." "It doesn't matter. Perhaps they're just friends." "Possibly," Lillian shrugged, clearly still slightly baffled. "Bye then, love. Take care." "Bye," Jan said and left the store. Perhaps they were just friends, Jan thought, but that didn't excuse Chris's weird behaviour on Wednesday evening. Chapter 32. Friday morning finally drew to a close, and at 12:30 Ian stood and took his jacket from the back of his chair. "Are you coming to Rocco's for lunch?" Mike, a work colleague, asked, also standing. They sometimes went to the cafe, either eating in or taking out, as did others from the office. "Not straight away," Ian said. "I'll catch up with you. I've a few things to do first." "Okay, see you later," Mike said, and headed out of the office. Ian needed to phone Emma first to make sure she was all right. It wasn't a conversation he could have with someone standing a little way off, waiting. Checking he had his phone and wallet in his jacket pocket, Ian left the office and went down the back stairs. The front of Weatherby Security was close to the main road where traffic noise made talking on the phone near impossible. But at the back, there was just the firm's car park. Ian found a quiet corner away from the main building and called their landline number. If he was honest, he was dreading speaking to Emma. She was always so down and short-tempered with him these days. He could picture her sitting on the sofa in their living room, whiling away the hours with daytime television or a book, or thumbing a magazine, mournful and dejected. "Are you okay?" he asked as soon as she answered, then straight away realised his mistake. He should have said, "How are you?" for clearly she wasn't okay. But to his surprise, Emma replied, "I'm good, thank you. A lot better." Her voice sounded brighter too. "Are you? That's great. Sorry about this morning. I hate it when we argue." "So do I," Emma said. "I was partly to blame. You were right about me getting back to work. I'm going to phone them this afternoon and suggest I start back on Monday. Anne, our midwife, persuaded me. She visited earlier." "Oh, I see," Ian said, slightly disappointed that he hadn't been the one responsible for Emma's change of heart. "Well, that's good." "Yes, we had a long chat. She knows exactly the right thing to say. She doesn't mind talking about what happened to David. She said I could talk to her whenever I wanted to. She understood. I even asked her what David looked like." Ian grimaced. "I thought we'd agreed it was better we didn't know." "Yes, but I'm glad I did ask. I was expecting her to describe something horrible, but do you know what she said? That although he was born different, he was beautiful in his own sweet way." "Good." Anne said wherever David was now, she knew he was happy and at peace. It really helped Ian. I should have asked her before about David. "I'm glad it helped," Ian said. "We also talked about when I should go back to work, and she said there was no medical reason why I shouldn't return now. Indeed, she thought it was a good idea, but I should take it slowly. She gave me some literature on contraception. It's part of her job as a midwife. She said perhaps we'd like to consider sterilisation, as it's so important we don't have another child, given the same thing is likely to happen again. I don't see how she can be so certain, Ian said. We need all the facts before we can make that type of decision. Those DNA kits should be here tomorrow. Ian immediately realised his mistake and was expecting Emma to snap at him for mentioning DNA, but she didn't. I told Anne about your research, Emma said. She looked shocked and worried to begin with, then seemed to change her mind. She said if you found something to tell her and she'd discuss it with us. What did she mean by that? She wants to help us, Ian. She's so nice. She also said she knows another couple who are going through something similar to us, and it might be possible for her to put us in touch if they agreed. She said that sharing something like this can help. I said I'd let her know. All right, Ian said, while thinking the last thing he needed was to be saddled with someone else's horror story. I'm glad you're feeling better. I'm going for lunch now, so I'll see you later. Yes, bye. Thanks for phoning. See you later, love. Chapter 33. Ruby topped up their glasses of red wine as Jan gathered together the plates and took them into the kitchen. That was delicious, thank you, Ruby said. But you shouldn't have gone to all that trouble. No trouble. It was nice to cook for someone else for a change. When it's just me, it's pasta or a jacket potato. We'll have a pudding later, shall we? Oh, yeah, I'm full. Now, come and sit down and tell me what's been going on here. I understand from what you said so far that Chris turned out to be a bit of a weirdo. But what's wrong with the cottage? It seems idyllic, if you want time out, although I think I'd prefer it in summer. Jan sat in the armchair opposite Ruby. Ruby was on the sofa, her legs curled under her, Tinder at her feet. Their conversations so far had been mainly catching up, about work, relationships, their families and mutual friends, and village life. Jan had wanted to leave the rest until after they'd eaten, and she'd had a few drinks inside her. She mentioned Chris and their disastrous first date, and that she'd seen him with another woman the following day, but nothing about being stalked or strange happenings around the cottage. Now she needed to try to explain to Ruby what she'd seen without sounding hysterical. It's difficult to know where to begin, Jan said, taking another sip of her wine. Start at the beginning. That's what you always tell me when I have a problem. Ruby smiled. Jan nodded thoughtfully. Okay. For the first few weeks here, everything seemed fine. I mean, living in the country took a bit of getting used to, but I enjoyed the peace after everything that had happened. It gave me time to think, and I didn't see or experience anything odd. Then something started coming into the garden after dark, when the curtains were closed. I assumed it was an animal, out here in the middle of nowhere. Ruby nodded. It came right up to the window. Tinder always knew when it was there. His hackles would rise and he'd run to the back door, wanting to be let out to chase it. One night, he disappeared completely and didn't come back for hours. I was worried, thinking he'd got lost. When he did return, he was so pleased to see me, as if something had frightened him. I would think just getting lost scared him, Ruby said sensibly. Maybe, but then the next night, he came back with food stuck in his fur by his mouth. It was cooked meat, possibly sausage. It hadn't come from here, and there are no other houses until you get to Merryless. So I began to worry that there could be someone living in the woods. This cottage backs onto the deepest part of Coleshaw Woods, and you'd never know if there was someone in there. Couldn't a bird have dropped the food? Ruby suggested. I suppose so. Jan hesitated. How easy it was to explain away what was happening if you hadn't been here. But the next night, I caught a glimpse of something as Tinder chased it through the hedge at the bottom of the garden. It was dark, so I couldn't get a good view, but it was really strange. not like any animal I've ever seen. I researched online what animals live in the woods, and it just came up with the usual, like badgers, foxes, and so on. So I sort of convinced myself it could have been a fox. I told Chris. We were on good terms then, and he thought it could be a fox or a dog that had come from the village. He should know, living around here all his life, Ruby put in. That's what I thought, but then I discovered something that convinced me it couldn't be a fox. What? She had Ruby's full attention now. I promised Camille, the owner of the cottage, that I would cut the grass, and when I was in the back garden, I found track marks coming through the gap in the hedge. It was like a walkway through from the woods into the garden, lots of prints. So I knew it had been going on for some time, and there could be more than one of them. I continued cutting the grass, but I had this really strong feeling that I was being watched the whole time, and kept turning to check behind me. You're giving me the creeps now, Ruby said, instinctively glancing behind her towards the garden. There's a motion sensor light on the patio, Jan continued. Chris told me it was broken, but when I checked, it had been switched off. Camille said to save electricity, the cottage is on a meter. I switched it on, and once it was dark, I sat where you are, hoping to see whatever it was that was coming to the window. And did it come? It did, but it must have known the light was on. A small red light flashes when it's working. It avoided the sensor and came to the back door instead. I knew then it was too intelligent for a woodland animal. It seemed to know what I was doing. I let Tinder out and he chased it. I followed him, but it had gone through the hole in the hedge. Then I heard a noise behind me, and I spun round just in time to see a shadowy figure running down the sideway and disappear over the gate. I don't know what I saw, but Chris found Tinder in the village and brought him back at midnight. Did you tell him what happened? No, it seemed ridiculous. So was that the end of it then? No. I blocked up the hole in the hedge, which kept them out for a couple of nights, but then the next night, one came right up to the window. It was dark. I'd switched off the sensor light to save electricity, but it made eye contact, like a person would. I was terrified and phoned Chris. He came straight over and went down the garden. It was pitch dark, but the wood I'd used for blocking up the hedge was scattered all over the lawn. Whatever it was had removed it all. I was grateful to Chris for coming, and he stayed for a drink. It was then he asked me out. And the rest is history, as they say, Ruby said, finishing her glass of wine. Far from it. The following day, when it was light, I went into the garden and found the twine I'd used to tie the wood in place over the hole had been unpicked, not chewed through, which confirmed it wasn't an animal. I thought it must be a person to be able to do that, and I was really worried. I called the police and they sent an officer. He was helpful but couldn't find any evidence of an intruder. Well, I suppose that's reassuring, Ruby said. No, it's not. They're getting braver. When I walked to the village along the lane, I saw someone or something running between the trees. They've also been to the front door. Chris saw one of them when he brought me back on Wednesday evening, but he denied it. He suggested it was my imagination and said if I was so nervous about living in the cottage, then I should leave. He might be right, Ruby said, and topped up their glasses again. It's very isolated here, and maybe being all alone isn't right for you. You lost your bloke and job in the same week, which is very traumatic. I can understand why you wanted to get away, but perhaps you've been by yourself long enough? I thought you might say that, but I have proof, Jan said. Really? You know, I said I bumped into Chris with a woman in the woods yesterday. Yeah. Just before that, while I was in the deepest part of the woods near the back of the cottage, Tinder found a ball of twine that had been taken from the shed in the garden here. I threw it towards the back garden. I've no idea where it landed, but later the doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, I saw it on the front doorstep. There was no one there, just the ball of twine. I'm sure someone saw me pick it up in the woods and was trying to scare me, to let me know they were watching me. Chris? Ruby suggested doubtfully. But why? Jan shook her head. I don't think so. I left it out the front, but then this morning I found the same ball of twine outside the back door, placed on the patio where I couldn't miss it. I've left it there for you to see. So it's still there? Ruby asked. Yeah. I checked just before you came. Come on, I'll show you. Jan took Ruby into the kitchen and opened the back door. Her heart sank. It's gone, she exclaimed. They've taken it. They know you're here and they're playing tricks on me. Jan saw the look of pity on her friend's face and knew she didn't believe her. She began searching the patio and garden as Ruby watched from the back door. It was late afternoon, and on an already overcast day the light was fading fast and the air was chilling. Come in now, Ruby called. It's cold. Let's have that pudding and open another bottle of wine. Jan checked the sideway, but there was no ball of twine. She knew she was making a fool of herself. Reluctantly, she came in. It was there, she said helplessly. They've taken it while we were in the living room. But look at this. I have more proof. She grabbed her phone. See this photo? I took it this morning. Footprints all over my car. The same track marks I found by the gap in the hedge at the bottom of the garden. Ruby peered at the photo. I can see muddy prints on your car, she said, but that could be anything. Jan heard her friend's rationality, and standing here with her now, she could see the muddy marks weren't proof, and could indeed be anything. She felt Ruby gently touch her arm. Jan, I think you've seen something and you got spooked by living out here all alone. Why don't you come and stay with me for a while? I have a spare room. I'm at work all day, and you'd have the place to yourself. I'll think about it, Jan said, then realised she'd sounded curt. Thank you, she added, and thanks for listening. I'm sure you're right. So let me get that pudding and we'll talk about something else. The look of relief on Ruby's face said it all. Chapter 34. It was after midnight by the time Jan was in bed, but she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, with the afternoon's conversations running through her head as if set on a loop. It was torture. Tinder was on the bed beside her, also restless. It was clear Ruby hadn't believed her, and who could blame her? It had sounded so far-fetched. No one else had seen anything apart from Chris, and he'd denied it. Perhaps he'd been telling the truth, and he really hadn't seen anything. Perhaps there was nothing to see. There was no real evidence, Jan conceded, and began to question her own sanity. The ball of twine could have been blown from the patio into the shrubbery by the wind, as Ruby had later suggested. And the muddy footprints on her car could indeed be anything, including foxes, squirrels, or large birds. Jan tossed and turned, and kept checking the time on her phone. She'd offered Ruby her bed, but she'd insisted on taking the sofa in the living room, which converted into a bed. Yet she had seen something, and more than once, Jan thought. Or had she? Was it possible that living alone in the cottage, following the trauma of losing her job and her partner, she was imagining things, even hallucinating? Ruby evidently thought so. Perhaps she should take up her offer to stay with her, But she'd have to give Camille notice first and then allow her time to make arrangements for someone else to stay in the cottage and look after Tinder. She'd feel bad letting Camille down, but if her mental health was suffering, then she shouldn't stay any longer. Half an hour later, Jan had made the decision that tomorrow she'd accept Ruby's offer to stay and go as soon as Camille had sorted out arrangements for Tinder. Jan would email Camille first thing in the morning. Once at Ruby's, she'd be able to take stock of her life and maybe see a therapist to help her deal with all the bad stuff that had been going on. With the decision made, Jan finally fell asleep. It was 9 o'clock when she woke. The sky outside was light. She could hear Ruby moving around downstairs, getting out of bed. Jan put on her dressing gown and slippers and went down. "Sorry, I overslept. I'm not much of a host," she said, going into the living room. Ruby was dressed. The curtains had been opened and the sofa bed put away. Ruby looked tired and drawn, and Jan immediately felt guilty. She should have insisted she took her bed. "I'll make her some breakfast," she said. "No, I'm going, and I want you to come with me," Ruby said as she packed the last of her belongings into her weekend bag. "Why so soon?" Jan asked, surprised. "I was going to make us breakfast." "I don't want anything to eat, thank you. I've had a glass of water, and I'm going now. I want you to come with me," she said again. "I can't, not just like that. I need to call Camille first so she can find someone to look after Tinder. Bring the dog if necessary," Ruby said. "But I think you should get out of here." She zipped shut her case. Jan stared at her. "Why? What's happened?" Ruby met her gaze. "It's not your imagination, Jan. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. There is something or someone out there. I heard them last night, tapping at the window. I opened the curtains, but they're gone. I haven't slept a wink." "Tapping at the window?" Jan asked. "I haven't heard that before. Could it have been the wind causing something to tap on the glass?" "No, Jan. I know what I heard. It was more of a knock than a tap, as if someone was trying to get my attention. Why didn't you come and get me? And spook you even more? I thought about phoning the police, but what could I have said? That I've heard a tapping noise, and when I opened the curtains there was nothing there." She picked up her case. "Come on, Jan, please, come with me. I'm worried about you." "I can't, not straight away. I'm not even dressed, and I need to tell Camille." "I'll wait while you dress then. Bring the dog." "I can't. He doesn't travel well. I have to look after him here and the cottage until Camille can find someone else." "And I can't change your mind?" Ruby asked. "No, it's just not practical for me to up and leave." "Are you sure?" Jan nodded. "Your decision, but come as soon as you can. Take care and look after yourself. This place gives me the creeps." Ruby kissed Jan's cheek and then headed down the hall where she opened the front door. "Sure I can't persuade you?" she asked one last time. "No, I'll be okay. You drive safely. Speak soon." Jan watched Ruby get into her car, turn it around, and then drive off a Longwood Lane. As Jan closed the front door, she felt strangely calm, exonerated. She had the evidence she needed. She wasn't losing her mind. Ruby had heard something too. Last night, Jan had gone to sleep convinced it was her imagination, but Ruby had just proved otherwise. There was something out there, and she intended to find out what before she left. Chapter 35. Still in her dressing gown, Jan made herself a coffee. Although she was reassured she wasn't imagining things, she didn't feel any less threatened. Far from it. Whatever it was getting braver by the day, and appeared to be closing in on her. When she'd first arrived, it or they had stayed away, hiding in the woods, possibly watching her and waiting to make their move. After a few weeks, they'd begun coming into the garden, but had been scared off by Tinder. Their confidence had grown, and they'd become bolder, making eye contact at the window, running through the trees in Wood Lane, leaving the ball of twine where she could see it. Then last night was their boldest move yet, tapping on the glass to attract Ruby's attention. Pity they hadn't done it when Chris was here. They were becoming fearless, but who were they? Jan wondered what would have happened if Ruby had opened the back door as she'd been doing. Would they have run away or stood their ground? Jan thought she knew the answer. They would have stayed. And done what? It was a shame Ruby hadn't woken her. Together they might have found the courage to go outside to investigate. As it was, Ruby had left saying the cottage gave her the creeps. Jan had to smile. Her usually sensible, pragmatic and rational friend had rushed out of the door, more unnerved than she was, which left her no nearer to finding out who or what was out there. If she slept on the sofa one night, out of sight, with the curtains open and the light off, would they return? If they did, she might be able to get a good look at them, perhaps even take a photograph. There was no point in switching on the motion sensor light, as they'd already shown they knew when it was operating and could avoid it. Did she have the nerve to stay downstairs in the dark and wait for them to reappear? She honestly wasn't sure. It felt safer to be upstairs in bed. The doorbell rang, making her start. Ruby? Had she forgotten something? Or perhaps she was returning to try to persuade her to leave again. Jan set her mug of coffee on the table and, drawing her dressing gown closer, went to answer the door. Tinder ran beside her, wagging his tail as if he knew who was there. "Oh, it's you," Jan exclaimed, astonished. "Sorry, I should have phoned first to check you were up," Chris said apologetically. "I had a friend stay last night and we were up late. Why are you here?" "I offered to repair your fence this weekend. I've got the tools in my car." "Oh," Jan said again, amazed. How long ago that offer now seemed. "I didn't think you'd come after Wednesday evening. I've done it myself." "I'm sorry about that. You know me. I can be a moody bugger sometimes. Would you like me to check the repair is holding up?" Jan thought she didn't know Chris at all, and her first reaction was to tell him the fence was fine and he needn't bother to contact her again. But she hesitated. "I can come back later if it's more convenient," he offered. "No, come in." She stood aside and let him pass. "I'll leave you to check the fence while I get dressed." "I'll see what needs doing, then get my tools from the car," Chris said, and headed down the hall with Tinder at his heels. Bemused, Jan went upstairs to dress. What the hell? He was right when he said he was a moody bugger. But he'd seemed genuinely apologetic. And now he was here, he may as well check the fence, although she wouldn't be confiding in him again. As Jan dressed, she heard Chris come in the back door and then let himself out of the front to go to his car. Standing a little way back from the bedroom window so he couldn't see her, she watched him as he opened the boot of his car. He was good-looking in a rugged sort of way. She'd always thought so. Tall, fair, with high cheekbones, but more at ease while doing something practical than making polite conversation over dinner. She watched him take his overalls and a tool bag from the car boot, and then close the lid. Oddly, he didn't immediately return into the cottage, but stood in the middle of the lane, looking up and down as if looking for something or someone. Apparently satisfied, he came in. Jan finished dressing, brushed her hair and went downstairs. She'd shower later. Slipping on her jacket, she went into the garden. It was a cold day. Chris, now wearing an all-in-one boiler suit, was leaning into the hedge using a portable electric screwdriver to insert long screws into the wood. "You did a good job," he said, pausing and turning to look at her as she approached. "Your repair has stood up reasonably well. I'm putting in 3-inch screws to reinforce it." "Thank you," she said, and watched him. He knelt as he worked, which made him appear almost vulnerable, certainly approachable, and not temperamental and withdrawn as he'd been on Wednesday. "What do you think is getting in?" Jan asked after a few moments. "Could be anything," he replied, "but it won't hurt you, I'm sure." "How can you be sure?" He paused again to look at her. "There aren't any dangerous animals in these woods?" "So why do they keep coming to the cottage?" "Looking for food," which is what he'd said before. Jan continued to watch him, and then asked, "Would you like coffee and croissants? I haven't had breakfast yet." "Yes, please, if it's no trouble." "It's not." She went indoors, threw her jacket over a chair, then brewed more coffee and put the croissants she'd originally bought for Ruby to warm in the oven. Chris was doing her a favour, so she could at least be civil, although she wouldn't be talking any more about the weird sightings. 5 minutes later he came in. "All done," he said, and stepped out of his overalls. "Thank you." Jan carried the tray containing the mugs of coffee and a plate of croissants through to the living room and placed them on the coffee table. Chris took his overalls and toolbox to the front door. "So I don't forget them," he said, with a self-deprecating smile as he returned. He sat in his usual armchair. "Help yourself," she said, offering him a side plate and the croissants. "Thanks. These didn't come from Lillian's store." "No. I drove into Coleshaw yesterday, but I did stop off there on the way back. I met your double." "Oh yeah, Robert Jarvis," Chris said. "We do look alike." "Very much so." There was an awkward silence, and Jan concentrated on her croissant. Then Chris said, "Lillian gave me a right bollocking for my behaviour and told me to apologise. I am sorry, Jan. I know my reaction when you told me Tinder had been in Camille's belongings was completely over the top." She nodded. "It's forgotten," she said easily, and meant it. Any thoughts she'd had about dating Chris had gone, so with no vested interest, it was easy to forgive him. "You see, Camille and I have history," Chris said, concentrating on his plate. "It's fine, really," Jan said. "That's your business. You've obviously been able to move on." He looked up questioningly. "Anne?" Jan said. "Oh, goodness me, no. Anne is a friend of Camille's and mine, that's all. When I told her of the problems you'd been having and that I was going to check the fence at the back of the cottage, she offered to go with me." "So that's why you were in the woods, checking the fence?" Jan asked. "Yes." But Jan remembered the expression on Anne's face and wasn't so sure. "You didn't find a ball of twine while you were there?" she asked. "Like the one I used to tie the planks of wood in place?" "No, but I can soon get you some more if you need it. They're cheap enough, and I'm certain Lillian stocks them." "It's all right. There's some in the shed." There was another awkward silence. Chris finished his croissant and then asked, "So you had a friend to stay last night?" "Yes, Ruby." "A woman, then?" Jan nodded. He drained the last of his coffee and, standing, put the china in the sink. "I'd better be going," he said, ruffling Tinder's fur. "Those screws should keep the fence in place. But if you have any more trouble, let me know." "Thank you." Jan went with him to the front door. He was about to open it but stopped and turned to her. "I'm truly sorry about Wednesday," he said. "I'd like to make it up to you and take you out again." "Really?" Jan said, surprised. "Yes, really. Lillian suggested I take you to the cinema where I can't talk and put my big foot in it again." Jan found herself smiling. Let me think about it. Okay, thanks. She watched him go. Would she accept his invitation? She wasn't sure. Nice of him to apologize and help her out, though. Chapter 36. As night fell, Jan's unease at being alone in the cottage returned. Ruby had been right when she'd said it was creepy. The cottage was picturesque during the day, but as the sun set, it blended in with the woods, as if the trees were advancing, laying claim to it and its inhabitants. Before it was completely dark, Jan went from room to room, switching on lights and closing curtains. Then she checked the front and back doors were locked and bolted. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat on the sofa in the living room. Tinder jumped up and sat beside her. Although Chris had secured the wood over the hole in the hedge with very long screws, Jan was sure it wouldn't make much difference. Her repair work had still been there the night before, when Ruby had heard something tapping at the window. They were using a different way in. As she sat there, nursing her glass of wine with the night ahead of her, Jan wished she could have taken up Ruby's offer to stay straight away. But not only would she have been running away, she would be letting down Camille big time. She could imagine her disappointment when the purpose of leasing out the cottage was to have someone take care of Tinder in his own home. Someone reliable and trustworthy who likes dogs, Camille's advertisement had read. Jan cringed. Jan finished her first glass of wine and was about to refill when her phone rang. Camille's number showed on the display. That was a weird coincidence, she thought, as she answered. It was only the second time she'd phoned. All their contact had been by email or text. Coincidence? Or had Chris been in touch with her? "How are you doing?" Camille asked brightly. "All right, thank you," Jan replied. "How are you?" "Work's challenging, but otherwise I'm okay. How's Tinder?" "He's fine." "Do you both have everything you need?" "Yes, thank you. You left him plenty of food." "Chris called a short while ago and said you were having problems with forest animals coming into the garden." So it wasn't pure chance she was calling. "Yes." "Don't worry, it happened to me, but they won't harm you. Chris tells me he's fixed the hole in the hedge, so that should keep them out." "Do you know what they are?" Jan asked. "No, it was always dark. Tinder used to chase them off. I guess they get hungry in winter." "That's what Chris said." "You're not worried, are you?" Camille asked. "No." "Good. Well, hopefully Chris's repair work has done the trick. It was nice of him to give up his Saturday to fix it. He's a good guy. Someone you can trust." "Yes," Jan said while thinking, if he's that wonderful, why did you two separate? "Thanks for all you're doing," Camille said. "I don't know what I would have done without you. Tinder can't be left in kennels. I've tried, but he pines so badly he stops eating. I'm very grateful to you." "You're welcome," Jan said. Camille wound up the conversation. Coward, Jan scolded herself. It would be even more difficult now to give notice when the time came. Doubtless Chris had told her she was anxious and imagined all sorts of ridiculous things. Without proof, it was just that, ridiculous. Jan needed concrete evidence, and then she'd give notice. The ball of twine and muddy footprints on the car hadn't convinced Ruby, rightly so. She'd had to hear them before she believed her. What Jan needed was a photograph, or better still a video clip. But how to get that? They were fast, and as soon as they saw her they bolted. Suddenly, a noise came from outside. Tinder shot off the sofa and ran to the back door barking. Surely they weren't here already. It was barely dark. Could this be the opportunity she needed to get a picture? Grabbing her phone and with her heart racing, Jan rushed to the back door and opened it. But there was nothing there. No movement, no shadow in the dark. Tinder ran to the bottom of the garden but couldn't get out. Chris's repair work must still be in place. "Come on," she called him. "Tinder!" The night was cold, and she wanted to close the door. He came out of the hedge and trotted up the lawn towards her. "Good boy," she said as he came in. She was about to close the door when she suddenly heard a woman's voice cry out in the woods, "No, stop!" Jan froze. Someone was out there in the woods at night. A woman. She sounded as though she was in trouble. "Who's there?" Jan called into the dark. There was no reply, not a sound. She waited a moment longer, closed the back door, then pressed 999 on her mobile for the emergency services. "Police," she said, as the call handler asked her which service. "Putting you through now." "I live in Ivy Cottage, Wood Lane. It backs onto Coleshaw Woods," Jan began as soon as she was connected. "I've just heard a woman shout in the woods. She sounded as though she was in trouble. Please hurry, I'm sure she's in danger and could be hurt." Chapter 37. Jan paced the living room, phone in her hand, waiting for the police. The officer who'd taken all the details had said they'd send someone straight away. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Jan summoned her courage and opened the back door a little, just enough to hear, but the woods remained eerily quiet. There had been that one cry, then nothing. She closed the door, and another 5 minutes passed. Where the hell were the police? Tinder was at her feet, staring up at her, concerned. She patted him, and he looked back with large, inquiring eyes. It was now 20 minutes since she'd called the police. They'd said a car was on its way. Surely it should be here by now, together with an ambulance. Perhaps they'd gone straight into Coleshaw Woods, Jan thought. And kneeling on the sofa, gingerly parted the curtains. She couldn't see any torch beams in the woods or flashing lights suggesting a police car or ambulance was there. She went upstairs into the second bedroom at the rear of the cottage, from where she had a better view. But there were no lights in the woods. That poor woman could be lying badly hurt, even bleeding to death. Jan returned to the living room. A few minutes later, she was startled by a sharp ring on the doorbell, followed by a loud knock on the door. Tinder shot under the table. The police? She hadn't heard a siren. With mounting unease, Jan went down the hall and to the right of the door, where there was a small lattice window in an alcove. You couldn't see who was at the front door from it, just the lane in front. She eased back the curtain and saw a police car parked in the lane. She opened the door to 2 uniformed police officers. "Thank goodness you're here," she said. "Have you found her?" "Yes, she's fine. We've spoken to her," the lead officer said. "You have?" Jan asked, amazed. "She was driving out of Wood Lane as we were coming in. We thought you'd want to know she was safe." "Well, yes. So she's not hurt then?" Jan asked, confused. "Nope. She was shouting at her dog." "Really? What was she doing in the woods after dark?" "She was walking her dogs early this evening when one chased after something and disappeared. She'd been searching for him ever since and then caught a glimpse of him through the trees. That's why she shouted, 'No, stop!' She has him now and she's sorry she caused you worry." "Oh," Jan said, relieved. "I thought she was being attacked." "No harm done. Always best to call us if you hear anything suspicious. You're isolated out here. Yes, I am, Jan agreed, not really appreciating the reminder. We'll be off then. Thank you. Sorry to have wasted your time. Not at all. Enjoy the rest of your evening. They said a polite good-night, and Jan closed and bolted the front door. She returned to the living room deep in thought. Of course she was relieved the woman was safe, but there was something bothering her. The voice she'd heard had sounded panic-stricken, not someone calling her dog. Also, the more she thought about it, the more familiar the voice had sounded, as though she might have heard it somewhere before. But try as she might, she couldn't place it. Perhaps it would come to her in time.